There is a sound many of us hear before we even open our eyes. A vibration on the nightstand. A chime from across the room. A soft digital pulse reminding us that the world is already waiting. Now imagine waking up without any of it. No glowing screen. No overnight alerts. No endless stream of updates arriving before sunrise. Just the creak of floorboards, the movement of morning air, and somewhere in the distance, the slow rhythm of a horse pulling a buggy down a country road. For most of us, silence has become unusual, even uncomfortable. But for many Amish communities, a life with far fewer screens and notifications is not a wellness trend or a weekend experiment. It is part of an older moral logic, a way of organizing attention, family, work, and faith. And once you begin to think about Amish life through sound, something surprising happens. You stop seeing it as simply a story about rejecting technology. It becomes a story about what replaces the noise. What enters a life when constant digital interruption does not. Because the real question is not only what the Amish have chosen not to hear. It is what they are still able to hear because of it. The Amish are often described from the outside in simple visual terms. Plain clothing, horse-drawn buggies, farms, no television, no cars parked in the driveway. But that familiar image can flatten a much more complex reality. Amish communities are not identical. Their rules vary by district. Their relationship with technology is not just a blanket refusal. In many places, the issue is not whether a tool is modern, but whether it strengthens family and community or quietly pulls them apart. That distinction matters. The Amish are not famous because they have no machines at all. In some communities, batteries are used. Some tools are adapted. Some businesses use limited forms of technology under carefully negotiated conditions. What matters is control, pace, and the moral effect of a tool on daily life. Will it anchor people more deeply to one another, or will it scatter their attention? Will it serve the community, or rewire it? And this is where the soundscape becomes so revealing. Because a culture is not shaped only by what it believes. It is shaped by what it repeats every day. The sounds that wake it up. The sounds that interrupt it. The sounds it treats as normal. In the modern world, many of those sounds are artificial and designed to demand us. Ringtones, alerts, message pings, autoplay videos, electronic hums, breaking news banners, navigation prompts, background podcasts, notifications from people we know and people we don't. Even when we are alone, we are acoustically crowded. But in Amish life, the texture of the day is often different. Not empty. Not silent in the literal sense. Just filled with other things. Morning does not begin with a swipe. It begins with chores. There is a physical quality to Amish time that many non-Amish people only experience on vacations or in childhood memory. The clatter of dishes. The scrape of a chair across a wooden floor. The door opening to cold air. The sound of boots on dirt or snow. The rustle of clothing. The splash of water. The crackle of a stove. The low sounds of animals already awake before people are fully speaking. It is easy to romanticize that. And we should be careful not to. Amish life is not peaceful because it is easy. It is often physically demanding, disciplined, and structured by obligation. This is not a curated, slow-living aesthetic sold in modern packaging. It is work, repetition, religious commitment, community expectation. The sound of a rooster at dawn is charming only until you realize the day ahead may be full of labor. But that was only part of the story. Because the absence of screens does more than remove distraction. It changes the way sound functions inside the family. In most modern homes, sound is often imported from elsewhere. Voices come through speakers. Music comes through headphones. Entertainment arrives from distant servers. Each person can disappear into a separate audio bubble. In one room, someone is watching short videos. In another, someone is gaming with a headset on. Another person is scrolling in silence. Technically, everyone is home. Acoustically, they are somewhere else. In an Amish household, that separation often works differently. Without personal televisions, without the constant pull of internet media in the home, without devices chirping for attention every few minutes, sound remains more local, more shared. You hear the room you are actually in. the people near you, the task in front of you. Conversation carries a different weight in that kind of environment. So does boredom. So does waiting. And maybe that is one of the hardest ideas for a modern audience to sit with. Boredom is not always the enemy. In a culture of relentless stimulation, boredom feels like a glitch. Something to eliminate instantly. But in less mediated worlds, boredom can become a doorway. To observation. To patience. To memory. To daydreaming. To craft. To prayer. To noticing. When a child grows up without constant digital entertainment on demand, the world competes differently for attention. A fence line, a field, a sibling, a tool, a task, a story told by an older relative, a hymn sung slowly from memory. These things are not up against an algorithm designed by thousands of engineers to outcompete reality. That changes childhood. Not perfectly, not magically, but deeply. And this is where the Amish soundscape becomes more than an atmospheric detail. It becomes a form of training. Listen closely to a modern life and you can often hear fragmentation. Half-finished thoughts. Interrupted meals. A sentence broken by a buzz. A moment of stillness broken by the reflex to check. We are conditioned to respond, and respond quickly. Our soundscape teaches urgency. The Amish soundscape often teaches something else. Continuity. A sound continues until it ends naturally. Hoofbeats pass and fade. A hymn stretches far longer than modern ears expect. A conversation unfolds in full. Chores begin, continue, and finish. The day has rhythms, but fewer alarms. Fewer invisible hands reaching into the room. What makes this even more interesting is that the Amish have preserved this not by pretending modern technology does not exist, but by judging it morally before adopting it. That is an important difference. Many people assume the Amish reject technology because they fear novelty itself. But in reality, many Amish communities ask a more difficult question than most of us do. Not, is this efficient? Not, is this profitable? Not, will this make life easier? But, what will this do to our relationships? That question sounds simple. It is not. A car, for example, is not just a faster vehicle. It expands distance. It weakens local dependence. It makes it easier to leave, easier to scatter, easier to orient life around the individual rather than the community. A telephone inside the home is not only a device. It is a permanent opening to the outside world. A television is not only entertainment. It is a pipeline of values, desires, and habits arriving daily without invitation. Even electricity from the public grid can be understood, in this logic, as more than power. It is a connection, a dependency, a line tying the household more tightly into a wider system whose values may not be the community's own. So the Amish response is often selective, not absolute. Some technologies are modified. Some are pushed outside the home. Some are allowed only for business. Some are rejected because they change the home from a place of presence into a place of intrusion. And once you view technology through sound, these decisions make even more sense. A screen does not enter a room silently. It brings its own acoustics, its own pace, its own priorities. Even muted, it changes attention. It teaches a person to expect something more exciting than the present moment. Notifications intensify that effect. They are tiny acoustic claims on the soul. Each one says, in its own way, not this, something else. Imagine a culture trying, very intentionally, to resist that sentence. Not this, something else. That may be one reason Amish worship sounds the way it does. In many Amish communities, church is held not in a dedicated church building, but in homes, rotating from family to family. Services happen every other Sunday. There are no organs, no choirs in the modern sense, no amplified sound system pushing emotion through a speaker stack. Instead, there is slow, unison singing in German, without instruments, often from memory or from the Ausbund, a hymn book with roots going back centuries. To modern ears, that kind of singing can feel startling at first. It is long, deliberate, almost suspended in time. It does not rush to keep attention. It asks attention to slow down enough to meet it. That matters. Because in much of modern media, sound is engineered to hold us. Cut fast enough, swell at the right second, keep the dopamine curve alive. Amish worship does nearly the opposite. It resists spectacle. It resists performance. It resists making faith feel easy or entertaining. And whether or not one shares Amish theology, there is something profound in that refusal. It says that not every meaningful sound should be optimized. Some should require patience. Some should ask you to kneel. Some should gather a room without competing for applause. And this is where things begin to change. Because once we stop thinking of the Amish as people who simply live without technology, and begin thinking of them as people who curate the moral environment of attention, they become harder to dismiss. Even for people who would never want to live as they do. In our world, the default is adoption first, reflection later. A new app appears, and only years afterward do we ask what it did to our concentration, our sleep, our children, our politics, our memory, our loneliness. The Amish often reverse that order. The tool must answer to the community before the community answers to the tool. That does not make Amish life frozen in time. In fact, one of the most interesting things about Amish society is that it continues to adapt. Some communities use battery-powered lights on buggies. Some use solar panels to charge batteries. Some businesses operate tools with off-grid power. Some offices use restricted computers without open internet access. Some phones exist in separate spaces rather than inside the home. The line is not always where outsiders expect it to be. But that flexibility does not weaken the principle. It reveals it. The point is not purity for purity's sake. The point is to keep the household from being acoustically colonized by the outside world. That phrase may sound dramatic, but think about how many people today no longer control the emotional weather of their own home. News alerts, group chats, social feeds, advertising, video platforms, work emails, endless commentary. All of it arrives instantly, often with sound attached. A person may be sitting at the dinner table while mentally standing in 10 other places. The Amish, whatever else one thinks of their rules, recognized something early. Devices do not merely add conveniences. They rearrange presence. And perhaps nowhere is that more visible than in the difference between noise and attention. A horse and buggy is not silent. A farm is not silent. Children are not silent. Amish life contains labor noise, animal noise, weather noise, the sounds of tools, wheels, footsteps, doors, washing, sawing, hammering, wind moving through open land. But these sounds are mostly tied to place and purpose. They belong to the life being lived. A notification sound is different. It often arrives from nowhere visible, carrying urgency detached from the room you're in. It can interrupt prayer, interrupt dinner, interrupt sleep, interrupt grief, interrupt a child mid-sentence. It slices through context. Now multiply that by years. Multiply it by adolescence. Multiply it by every meal, every morning, every pocket of potential stillness. Suddenly, the question is not whether the Amish are missing out. The question becomes whether modern people have lost the ability to protect any inner acoustic territory at all. Here is the pattern interrupt. The Amish soundscape is not mainly about silence. It is about authority. Who gets to speak into your day? Who is allowed to interrupt your family? Who decides what deserves your attention right now? Most of us answer those questions passively, with our settings turned on by default. The Amish answer them communally, sometimes rigidly, sometimes imperfectly, but intentionally. And that intention has consequences. For one thing, memory works differently in less interrupted environments. When stories are told more often face-to-face, when songs are learned through repetition rather than playlist culture, when practical knowledge is passed down through apprenticeship and routine, sound becomes a carrier of tradition in a literal sense. You remember the voice that taught you, the cadence of prayer, the tone of a parent calling from another room, the rhythm of work done by hand. In a digital culture, memory is often outsourced. We store less because devices store more. We do not need to remember directions, birthdays, lyrics, numbers, even certain kinds of grief, because everything can be summoned on command. That is convenient. It is also transformative. The mind changes when recall becomes optional. The Amish world, by comparison, still asks more from human memory, from direct observation, from repetition. Again, not because it is quaint, but because it is structurally different. The same goes for loneliness. This is a difficult point, because no community is free from loneliness, and Amish life has its own strains, limitations, and forms of pressure. It would be dishonest to portray it as emotionally seamless. Conformity can be heavy. Privacy can be limited. Expectations can be strict. Young people still wrestle with identity, doubt, desire, and belonging. Families still suffer loss. Communities still endure conflict. But loneliness behaves differently in a world where daily life remains more communal and less individualized by screens. In many modern settings, one can be constantly connected and profoundly alone. Surrounded by voices, but not accompanied. Reached by everyone, known by almost no one. Notifications can create the sensation of contact while starving the deeper experience of presence. The Amish, by organizing life around face-to-face community, shared labor, shared worship, shared meals, and local belonging, reduce some of that fragmentation. Not all of it, but some. And that matters because the sound of a life is also the sound of how often it is shared. How often someone hears their name spoken by a real voice nearby. How often they hear laughter that is not compressed through a speaker. How often they hear the ordinary noises of other people depending on them and being depended on in return. But there is another side to this story, and it should not be ignored. The Amish soundscape is protected by boundaries, and boundaries always have costs. A world with fewer screens may also be a world with fewer choices. Fewer avenues for self-expression. Less access to information. Less privacy. Less ability to escape the expectations of one's community. The same structures that preserve attention can also constrain individual freedom. For some, that feels like safety. For others, confinement. That tension is real. So if we are going to learn anything from Amish life, the lesson is not that everyone should imitate it wholesale. Most people would not want to. The lesson is more unsettling than that. It is that another relationship to technology is possible. Not perfect, not simple, but possible. The Amish remind us that convenience is not the highest good by default. That speed is not always wisdom. That being reachable at all times is not the same as being available to what matters. That a home can be designed to resist intrusion instead of absorbing it. That a community can ask, before adopting a tool, what kind of people the tool quietly trains them to become. And in a century of escalating digital saturation, that may be one of the most radical ideas left. Think about how rarely modern people ask whether a technology deserves a place in the home. We usually ask how quickly it can be integrated, how seamlessly it syncs, how much time it saves. But the Amish push a more human question to the front. What kind of sound will this introduce into our life? Will it bring the steady noise of machinery that serves real work? Fine. Will it bring a call necessary for business, but keep it outside the center of family life? Maybe. Will it flood the room with endless entertainment, comparison, vanity, temptation, distraction, and distant voices louder than the people at the table? Then perhaps the cost is too high. That framework does not belong only to the Amish. In fact, it may be exactly the framework modern people need if they are ever going to reclaim any peace from the devices they carry. Not total rejection. Not self-righteous unplugging for social media points. Just honest moral evaluation. What belongs in a human life? What belongs in a child's attention? What belongs in a bedroom, a dinner table, a Sabbath, a conversation, a morning? And what should stay outside? By now, the deeper truth may be clear. The Amish soundscape is not just the absence of buzzing phones. It is the presence of a different order. One in which the local remains louder than the distant. One in which tools are judged by whether they serve communion rather than consumption. One in which silence is not emptiness, but space where the textures of ordinary life can still be heard. The hoofbeats on gravel. The murmur of prayer. The slow hymn. The hand at work. The room without interruption. The child who does not yet expect every quiet moment to be filled. Maybe that is why this subject feels so compelling, even to people who would never live this way. Because buried beneath the curiosity is recognition. We know, at some level, that our world has become unbearably loud. Not just in volume, but in demand. Too many voices asking for reaction. Too many sounds designed to hijack attention. Too little room left for thought, reverence, or even simple presence. The Amish did not solve the human condition. No community does. But they did preserve a question we have almost forgotten to ask. What should a life sound like? And if the answer is no longer obvious, perhaps that tells us something about our own world. Maybe the most important thing about the Amish is not that they live differently. It is that their difference makes our habits audible. So the next time your phone lights up in a quiet room, the next time a conversation fractures because a device asks to be noticed, the next time you realize you have not sat in unbroken silence for more than a few minutes, remember this. There are still places in the modern world where the day is shaped less by alerts and more by intention. Places where attention is guarded. Places where sound still belongs mostly to the life being lived. And whether we admire that, question it, or feel challenged by it, we can still learn from it. Because in the end, the Amish soundscape is not only about them. It is also about us. About what constant noise has taken. About what silence might return. And about the possibility that a better life may begin, not when the world gets quieter on its own, but when we decide, very carefully, what we will allow to speak into it. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more calm, thoughtful stories about culture, history, and the hidden logic behind everyday life, subscribe to the channel. And if this video made you think differently about noise, technology, or attention, let me know in the comments. What does your life sound like when the notifications stop?